Hi guys, what's up? My name is David and welcome back to my channel. So, I've been talking about topics regarding the Viking Age quite a few times on my channel for obvious reasons. But today I wanted to shift the perspective to a more metaphysical one and ask what exactly is the Viking Age. So the thing with historical periods, right, is that they have not inherently had the name that they have now. This name has been given to them by later researchers in order to group certain events together. And when we talk about the Viking Age, it is generally assumed that we talk about the period from about 793, which was the attack on Lindisfarne Monastery in England by the Vikings, or at least people from Scandinavia who came by boats to the British Isles and attacked that monastery, until about 1066 when the battle at Stamford Bridge happened. And that was the end of Viking influence in the British Isles. But as you can hear, both these dates have something to do with England and Great Britain. And it is because researchers from the British Isles have been very interested in Viking Age history and still are. There are both bachelor's and master's level educational programs at universities like Oxford and Cambridge in regards to the Viking Age. And it's not weird because it is part of their history. And I say their in quotation marks because, who has a claim to history? But it is something that happened on the land which they now inhabit. So it is logical to assume that people would want to do historical research about it. But the Vikings were not English, right? The Vikings were Scandinavian, at least that's the main idea about what exactly the Vikings were. So why is the Viking Age assumed to have started and ended with something that has nothing to do with Scandinavia? In order for these conquests and voyages to happen, there must have been some social and economical developments in the Scandinavian countries themselves, right? So there are different ideas as to why the Viking Age happened. For example, that there wasn't enough money in the lands which now constitute Scandinavia, or that there was not enough land. But if you look at Scandinavia right now, I think one of the last things you would think is lack of land. They're not very tightly inhabited areas, so why would there be a lack of land in the Viking Age? This makes sense for Norway, because there's not a lot of land that is usable for farming, but that explains the emigration to the United States in the modern period and not the Viking Age. So other theories have been posed about the idea that actually it was going really well in these Scandinavian countries, but people needed to have stuff from other areas. Not everything was manufactured in Scandinavia. For example, silver. That's why silver had to be taken from elsewhere. And not necessarily taken, also just traded for other stuff. So there have certainly been some economic developments in these Scandinavian areas that have led to the possibility of overseas voyage, because time, resources, people were needed in order to build ships good enough to sail over the North Sea to England and later to the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and even Vinland, which is now considered to be Newfoundland in Canada. So this did not come out of nowhere, and definitely not out of poverty. But returning to my main point, what is the Viking Age? There have also been conquests to the east, which were significantly earlier than conquest to the west, but because the west considers itself more important, these voyages to Estonia and to later to the Rus, which is now Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, and Poland, they only have been really incorporated in Viking Age history in the past few decades, even though it's basically the same groups of people doing similar things, but in an area that is of less importance to people from the West, like England. So for me, it is strange that the Viking Age, which is kind of said to be something very Scandinavian, is defined in terms of when did they have something to do with the British Isles. But on the other hand, since there's a lot of research coming from the Anglophone world, I do understand that focus, and it has been an influence on Anglo-Saxon cultural exchange with people from Scandinavia. For example, the Danelaw, which allowed Scandinavians to settle and live on the British Isles, and then kings like Knut the Great, who came from Denmark and then ruled over England, or kings of York that came from Scandinavia. There were people in Dublin that came from Scandinavia. So I do see why this Viking Age is defined in terms of when the British Isles had something to do with it. But it's still weird to define a historical period based on when outsiders noticed that these people existed. Because when we look at Viking Age culture, it's not something that's just suddenly came into existence. For example, runes have been used since before the 8th century and after the 11th century. So runes are not inherently Viking, but are still associated with the Viking Age. Same for Viking Age beliefs. There are inscriptions mentioning gods like Odin from the 5th century, which was also way before the Viking Age, and still these deities are considered Viking gods, which, yes, they were probably worshipped in the Viking Age, but also before. And speaking of that, the Viking Age is also sometimes seen as this pagan part of Scandinavian history. But let's not forget that Christianity was introduced into the Scandinavian region in the Viking Age. So it can also not really be defined in terms of religion. And while this was definitely a part of why it ended, because Christian Scandinavia was incorporated in the Western world and the medieval period officially started, but still, there's a lot of overlap between earlier periods and later periods. And that's the thing with terms for historical periods like the Viking Age. Also considering the fact that this is a term specifically for the areas that were affected by the conquests and trading and raiding of these Norsemen. Because I got a comment recently, something about, did the Viking Age happen in Germany? And there's a lot of things to unpack there. First, that Germany as a country did not exist in the Viking Age, but then again, neither did Scandinavia as a region. So these are just modern terms that are used for these areas or countries, which can be translated into history, but also maybe shouldn't be. And yes, obviously, places like Hedeby, which used to be Denmark but is now Germany, have been included in Viking territory. But that doesn't mean that the entire country of modern Germany had a Viking Age, because there were other peoples living there which had other histories. So yeah, they could have come into contact with people who were called Vikings, but that doesn't mean that the Viking Age happened there, if that makes sense. In the same way that just because there was a Norse siege of Paris doesn't mean that Paris had a Viking Age. It just means that the city of Paris had been incorporated in the network of cities and other places that were known to these Norse people in this time period. So yeah, returning to my original question of what is the Viking Age, there's a lot of institutionalized knowledge and facts about what the Viking Age is and what we should know about it. And I say facts in quotation marks not because I want to be some kind of conspiracy theorist and say don't believe in everything you hear. That's not what I want to say. But generally, historical facts are always based on things that we can never know 100% for sure. Even when something is clearly written in a chronicle, as it was with the attack on Lindisfarne and other events that are mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, it doesn't mean they actually happened in the way that they are described, because chronicles like that were a propaganda tool. They were biased. These people who wrote these chronicles did not know everything about these people that they were describing. They only saw them in a negative light as peoples that came to invade their home countries, so obviously they were negatively biased towards them. And then on the other hand, even through that negative bias, we can find some pieces of information that could be considered facts because they're not negative in modern standards. For example, English chronicles mentioning that the Scandinavians washed themselves like every week, which for their standards at the time was often, and that says something about the hygiene of the Norsemen and also of the English. But then again, we have sources like Ibn Fadlan, who writes about the Rus, which are considered people from what is now Sweden who went on conquests and settling and trading in Eastern Europe. And he wrote that they were actually very dirty and washed themselves in the same water and did lots of unhygienic things. But that then comes from the fact that he was Arabic and was used to washing his hands and feet like every time before praying. So these specific hygiene standards, whether you considered these people you described clean or dirty, also reflects your own culture, where you come from. And the same thing is relevant for modern day interpretations of Viking Age history. They are interpreted in different ways based on what your relationship is to these people. Obviously, people from Scandinavia or the Nordic region will have a different perspective towards Viking Age history than an outsider scholar, for example, because nationalism will be involved, even if it's not on purpose, in the sense that it's difficult to come to terms with the fact that the history of the country which you identify yourself with may not be as glorious as you have been led to believe. Even in modern days where history books are trying to be more and more critical of the past, there's always going to be some kind of national bias, which is why I personally, as someone who comes from Poland but has been living in the Netherlands for 15 years, I really enjoy studying Scandinavia because realistically I have nothing to do with it. I can't help the fact that I am very interested in Scandinavia and Viking Age history, but I don't have the need to present Viking Age history in a as positive light as possible. That is not what I'm here to do. I just simply want to look at the sources and secondary literature and then have my own conclusions and understandings based on that. That's also why I really want to master Old Norse, so that I can actually read sources myself in the original language that they have been written in. Like, I have this Edda, which is in modern Icelandic, which is pretty cool. I mean, but it's still not the real thing. But if everything goes well and I'm able to pursue my master's degree in Viking and Medieval Norse Studies, I will be able to have a look at the actual manuscripts and, yeah, just really see these source materials as they are and not as they have been interpreted and translated by other people. And I'm not saying that I will do that in the most objective way ever. I have my own biases too, but I am not going to pretend that I don't have them. Because when I look at something like this that I have, which is the Voyages of Ibn Fadlan, the Arabic traveler that I was talking about, he didn't write this book in English, obviously. He wrote it in Arabic. And even that is something that I'm willing to learn. And I know that not everyone is prepared to do that, and that is completely fine. I know that I am slightly insane, but it's still something that I would like to do, and I am not under the impression that I can ever know everything, so that's not what I'm striving for. I just want to be as informed as possible and make sure that through my potential later research, but also by things like my channel, I can inform people as well as I can and inspire people to inform themselves as well as I can and not just take my word or any other word for it. Like, it is so great to just have the same information said to you multiple times by different people with different backgrounds, because every time you learn this tiny little detail that is different from what you previously thought, and that makes your personal knowledge about the facts all the more wide and just better in general. So, to answer my question, what is the Viking Age? I'm gonna say I don't think there is one. I don't think there is one Viking Age. I think there are different Viking Ages depending on which area you want to focus on. There is a economic Viking Age when you can look at silver, you can look at slave trade, you can look at cultural exchanges like Middle Eastern grave goods found in Scandinavian graves or Scandinavian goods found in British graves. There is a cultural Viking Age where you can look at combinations of art styles. You can look at the introduction of runes to the British Isles. There is a religious Viking Age. You can look at the introduction of Christianity and how that has worked out in these particular Scandinavian regions. You can look at the political Viking Age. You can look at how power was structured. And you can look at the linguistic Viking Age. You can look at differences between runic inscriptions in Denmark versus in Sweden, because they are certainly different. And I think that's fascinating. I think you don't need to have one concrete view of this time period. It's okay to look at it from different perspectives, and that's why there's so many scholars looking at such specific aspects of it, and also in completely different cultures and completely different areas of expertise. It's always great to have an interdisciplinary approach. Have archaeologists look at the material, have linguists look at the material, have historians look at the material, have ethnologists look at the material, and only then will you come close to a sort of understanding of the time period. That's all I have to say for today. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I'm sorry for this light. The weather is so strange today, so the sun is like, I'm here, I'm not here anymore. I'm here, I'm not here anymore. But I hope that doesn't distract you from the purpose of this video, and I hope I made my point clear. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you like this video. Go watch my other videos if you liked this one, and I'll see you next week. Bye bye.